If you're going for a run, hiking through the woods, or just walking to the corner store for some milk, you have to keep those feet protected with some good shoes. But not all shoes are created equal, and while most shoes are here to help you out, some look absolutely ridiculous. So join us for today's video as we take a look at 15 of the most unusual types of shoes in the world. Number 15. Okobo. Japan has an incredibly rich culture, history, and traditions, many of which still play a role within society today. And one type of shoe that has managed to withstand the test of time is the Okobo. And while you may not be seeing them while riding the Tokyo subways and bullet trains, if you're lucky you may catch a glimpse of these unusual shoes if you see a maiko or an apprentice geisha. Okobo are similar to sandals and clogs from around the world, but will add a few inches to the wearer's height. These platform shoes weren't just a fashion statement though, they also served some practical functions. For instance, if you were wearing a fancy, expensive, and downright beautiful kimono, you don't want to risk the long garment getting mud on it, or even worse, tripping over it. So the long wooden Okobo will keep your kimono out of the dirt and keep you out of harm's way. These shoes typically measure 5.5 inches tall, and the wooden sole is carved hollow, giving them their distinctive sound as you come down the street. And that's actually where they get their name too, because Okobo is their onomatopoeia, or the sound they make. Number 14. Men's high heels. Style and fashion are always changing, but there are certain trends that have one specific gender in mind. High heels can be worn by anyone, of course, but we're still used to seeing them adorning women's feet. But in the 1700s, things were a little different. It was the men who were wearing the high heels along with a nice pair of stockings. Men of status were wearing breeches and tailored coats, bringing the gaze to the lower half of their body, and the shoes needed to keep up with the times as well. The high heels were meant to help give a better shape to a man's leg, and their flamboyant designs were pretty easy on the eyes too. But it was King Louis XIV who set the fashion trend for the rest of the men who could afford it, with his affinity for red-soled heels. And if the king is going to do it, then it must be cool. So for a time it became pretty common to see plenty of high-status men adding a few inches to their height and decorating their heels with ribbons, rosettes, and buckles to show just how elegant they were. Number 13. Kabkabs. These shoes, known as kakabs, were not only the height of fashion in Lebanon in the 14th century, but they were also one of the more practical ways for women to get around without getting dirt and mud on their feet as they navigated the wet, muddy streets and bathhouses. The idea here is to keep your feet as far from the ground as possible, but as usual it was mostly a luxury afforded to the women of the upper class. An especially fancy pair of these unusual shoes could be inlaid with mother of pearl or embroidered with leather, silk, velvet straps, silver, gold. And while it can be difficult to imagine not having clothing or accessories with these materials, they were pretty tough to acquire at the time. And much like Okobo, kabkabs got their name from the sound that they make while you're walking. But if you need something nice for a special occasion, then a woman could adorn the wooden stilts of her kabkabs by completely covering them with silver ornaments. But it's also important to remember that at the time, brides were often very young girls, and so the kabkab would give them a little more stature as well on their wedding day, with some being as tall as 2 feet. Number 12. Plaited birch bark shoes. The name is a bit of a mouthful, but the plaited birch bark shoes were the hot new thing in the early 20th century in Finland. Women were wearing shoes made of bark just about every day, and they were often lined with cloth inserts, seeing as how a foot full of wood may not be the most comforting thing in the world. But the plaited birch bark shoes could even be made a bit oversized and slip over some of the more expensive leather shoes of the time to protect them from rain, mud, and snow. Why not just get different shoes for different types of weather? Well, unlike today, folks weren't working with a closet full of shoes, so it was important to maintain what you had, and yeah, to look good doing it. These unusual types of shoes became pretty popular at the time, and other countries like Norway, Sweden, and Russia caught wind of the style and made their own versions too. The only catch with the birch bark shoes is that they had a solid lifespan of about a week, but the good thing is these shoes really do grow on trees. Number 11. Chopines. There are only a few examples in the museums of Italy of these unusual shoes, but during the 16th century they were all the rage. And these unusual shoes, known as Chopines, made their stunning debut during the Renaissance, so you know they were cutting edge. Similar to some of the previous entries on our list, the Chopines were incredibly impractical in design, but they did serve their purpose by making anyone who wore them stand out from the crowd, and stand above them too, because they gave the lucky lady wearing them an extra 5 inches in stature. They were incredibly expensive to boot. The Chopines were made of wood and covered with either a fine silk or velvet to add to their flair. Then they were embellished with a silver lace or tacks and given a little silk tassel as a finishing touch. Just try not to get them dirty. But the sad part about the extravagant Chopines is that the gowns of the time were so damn long that they always covered the shoes, so very few people ever got to witness their elegance. Number 10. Heelless Shoes. Moving hands of time forward to modern-day fashion, and you'll come across the unusual shoe known as the heelless shoe. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but perhaps there's no logical explanation as to why this thing exists. Making their debut in 2007 on Antonio Berardi's runway, the heelless shoe was made famous by none other than Victoria Beckham 1 year later. Mrs. Beckham is such a style icon that folks around the world will buy just about anything she's caught wearing, even if it means sacrificing comfort for look. But both the designer and the former Spice Girl will still claim that the shoe doesn't give the wearer any pain or discomfort, despite the appearance of the floating heel. Berardi designed the shoe to give them the perfect balance and to feel just like a regular shoe, but it's easy to say for someone who probably isn't walking around town in a pair of one of these expensive shoes. The heelless shoes did catch the attention of those in the medical community and podiatrists, and the general consensus among them is that the shoes could lead to permanent damage of the feet, knee, and spine, so maybe it's best to leave these things in the closet. Number 9. Padukas. Also known as toe knob sandals, Padukas are a ceremonial style of shoe hailing from India, and it's actually one of their oldest forms of footwear. But there's really not much to the Paduka. They're just a sole and a big old knob situated between the big and second toes. They look like the ancestor of the sandal, and well, that's because they are. Padukas were usually fashioned from wood, iron, silver, and even ivory, so it was more about the style itself than it was the status of the wearer. Then there was the spiked Paduka for the masochistic folks roaming the streets. But don't expect your average person to be rocking one of these painful Padukas. No, these were reserved for the Indian Hindu sadhus, or holy men, to not only prove their piety, but also as a form of penance and spiritual enlightenment. But don't expect to see these shoes on anyone's feet now, because they went out of style in the 1700s. Number 8. Wooden Bridal Shoes. Going as far back as the 9th century, these unusual wooden bridal shoes were all the rage in the Bothmal Valley in France. But taking just one good look at these things and you'll think that you found some elf shoes. The shoes are real, and they've got a strange and morbid history to boot. Back when the local villagers conquered the Moorish invaders and in retaliation for kidnapping their women, the elongated tips of these shoes were used to prick at the hearts of the enemy in celebration of the village's victory. Each of these wooden bridal shoes was made just out of one piece of the trunk of a walnut tree, which forms a rectangle at its roots. The branches are pulled and wrapped to create the pre-shape for these unusual and deadly-looking clogs. Eventually, the men of the village would create the clogs especially for their brides, making each shoe one of a kind. And the bigger and higher the point, well, then the greater his love for her is. Number 7. The Ballet Boot. Ballet and boot typically aren't two words you hear fitting together, but in the 1980s there was a select few who thought differently. This more contemporary style of footwear gained popularity somehow within the fetish community, but it quickly made its way out of the basement and into the streets, catching on as a fashion statement. And the ballet boot really made waves in Japan. The name says it all. The shoe takes the traditional look of the ballet slipper and adds the extreme high heel. The ballet boot forces the wearer to feel as on point as possible, making them feel like a ballerina, and probably inflicting the same amount of pain in the foot. The ballet boot probably saw its heyday in the 1980s, but it can still be found worldwide in specialty stores and online. But don't expect to see your colleagues wearing them around the office. Just like the heelless shoe, these specialty boots are not meant to be worn long-term, seeing as how it will cause serious damage to the toes, foot, and your ankle. Number 6. Armadillo Shoes. Sometimes when you buy a pair of shoes, you want to look good rather than feel good. And while that may not be the healthiest mindset in the world, it certainly comes in handy when you're a big-time designer looking to make waves in the fashion world. And Alexander McQueen was most definitely one of those people. This piece of high-end couture made its debut on the runway in 2010, and we're sure that the model was eager to take them off once the cameras stopped rolling. But you didn't have to be front and center for their debut to notice them, because they were, of course, brought to the masses by Lady Gaga in her music videos. And afterwards, plenty of other fashionable celebs started sporting these as well, especially the ones who don't mind looking a little silly on the red carpet. And while other, perhaps more accessible styles made their way to the masses, the Armadillo shoe is the original. So accept no imitations when it comes to this unusual shoe, and if you do manage to squeeze into a pair of these, you better find something to hold on to because your toes are going straight down, and that high heel on the back isn't going to be doing you any favors either. Number 5. Jellies. If you were a kid in the 1990s, then you will most definitely remember these bad boys. Jellies were a very hip yet unusual type of shoe, seeing as how they were made of PVC plastic. And since they're obviously no good during the winter months, that means you're wearing these in the warmer months, and no one would be caught dead wearing them with socks, meaning your feet were going to get extra sweaty and swampy when you're clomping around in them. Make sure you got the right size too, because if you were a little too big, and the inside is going to turn into a slip-and-slide for your feet. But if you managed to pick up a pair that were infused with glitter, then you were the coolest kid in school. But because of the PVC plastic used to make these unusual shoes, they were incredibly toxic and flat out bad for the environment. So if you're looking to keep your feet fresh and eco-friendly, these may not be the pair for you. Number 4. Circuit board sneaker. Perhaps the perfect pair of shoes for any nerds out there who get bored of their sneakers, the circuit board sneakers are something else. While they don't have any historical or cultural significance, or let the bourgeois know that you're one of them, they certainly are unusual shoes nonetheless. Designed by Gabriel Deschaux, these started out with a pair of upcycled Nikes, and they may have not caught on like some of the other pairs of shoes on our list. But with style names like the Frankenstein Terminator, Nike Freetime Y2K, and Junk Dunk, you can see the appeal of these soulful pieces of couture. But seeing as how the circuit board sneakers are mostly made out of, well, circuit boards, the odds of there being something you can walk in for more than 2 minutes are pretty slim. And even though they are Nikes, you do not want to run or play sports in them. No way. But maybe the dead computer parts and the funky names are what give the circuit board sneakers their short-lived appeal. But at this point, if you do manage to snag a pair, they may be best left on the mantle as a conversation piece. Number 3. Fake turf flip-flops. The next pair of unusual shoes are probably the perfect thing for nature lovers who can't make it to the great outdoors as often as they'd like. And with a name like the fake turf flip-flop, you should know exactly what you're getting into when you're slipping these fuzzy little guys on. That's because it feels like you're walking on grass without getting all the dirt between your toes. And even the occasional dog poo. The catch though, the cheaper the pair, the worse that fake grass is going to feel on your dainty little feet. So it's best to shell out the extra cash to get the maximum comfort, and the cheap ones can really tear your feet up if you're not careful. Number 2. Jigatabi. Japan has always been at the forefront of both cutting-edge technologies and fashions, and so the Jigatabi shoe is no different. The Jigatabi looks like a normal shoe until you get down to the toes. That's because the big toe is separated from the other little piggies. These boots have been worn all throughout history, though, and have only gotten better over the years. Hundreds of years ago, you may have even seen these on the feet of fishermen and even samurai. But today, they're a big hit with construction workers. Yep, the material the Jigatabi is made from is pretty darn sturdy, and they've got heavy-duty yet flexible rubber soles. Their biggest competition is steel-toe work boots, but a good pair of Jigatabi will get you an unbeatable grip. They're even a solid choice for gardeners and farmers working in the wet and muddy rice fields. So while these shoes may be unusual to a big chunk of the world, they've proven time and time again that they're a solid choice for anyone. Number 1. Lotus Shoes. Way back during China's Han Dynasty, women wore Lotus Shoes, which would cram their feet and toes so badly that the wearer's feet would look as small as the lotus bud. These were definitely a stylistic choice, but the ramifications of the Lotus shoes were pretty serious, and long-term use resulted in the toes essentially folding under the sole of the foot permanently. That means permanent bone damage that you get to suffer through for the rest of your life. But despite the pain of beauty, the Lotus shoe was a hot item amongst women for centuries. The Lotus shoes were typically made of cotton or silk, and if you could afford it, the shoe came with a bigger heel. Iron or wooden studs could be added to protect the silk and embroidery of the shoe as well, meaning a pair could hopefully last you through the years as long as you didn't get it too dirty. But the Lotus shoe also represented a woman's proficiency in needlework, as they often made lots of pairs as a part of a marriage dowry. And after the wedding, the Lotus shoes made by the bride became gifts to her female in-laws. Mass production of these Lotus shoes, though, has stopped, simply because they're so damn bad for your feet. But there are still some manufacturers who will make them for special order. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.